This is Chapter 31 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 31, Mark Twain in Buffalo. Mark Twain remained less than 2 years in Buffalo, a period of much affliction. In the beginning, prospects could hardly have been brighter. His beautiful home seemed perfect. At the office he found work to his hand and enjoyed it. His co-editor, J. W. Larned, who sat across the table from him, used to tell later how Mark enjoyed his work as he went along, the humor of it, frequently laughing as some new absurdity came into his mind. He was not very regular in his arrivals, but he worked long hours and turned in a vast amount of copy, skits, sketches, editorials, and comments of a varied sort. Not all of it was humorous. He would stop work any time on an amusing sketch to attack some abuse or denounce an injustice, and he did it in scorching words that made offenders pause. Once, when two practical jokers had sent in a marriage notice of persons not even contemplating matrimony, he wrote, "This deceit has been practiced maliciously by a couple of men whose small souls will escape through their pores some day if they do not varnish their hides." In May he considerably increased his income by undertaking a department called Memoranda for the new Galaxy magazine. The outlook was now so promising that to his lecture agent, James Redpath, he wrote, "Dear Red, I'm not going to lecture any more forever. I've got things ciphered down to a fraction now. I know just about what it will cost to live, and I can make the money without lecturing. Therefore, old man, count me out." And in a second letter, "I guess I'm out of the field permanently. Have got a lovely wife, a lovely house bewitchingly furnished, a lovely carriage, and a coachman whose style and dignity are simply awe-inspiring, nothing less. And I'm making more money than necessary by considerable, and therefore why crucify myself nightly on the platform? The subscriber will have to be excused for the present season at least." The little household on Delaware Avenue was indeed a happy place during those early months. Neither Clemens nor his wife in those days cared much for society, preferring the comfort of their own home. Once, when a new family moved into a house across the way, they postponed calling until they felt ashamed. Clemens himself called first. One Sunday morning he noticed smoke pouring from an upper window of their neighbor's house. The occupants, seated on the veranda, evidently did not suspect their danger. Clemens stepped across to the gate and, bowing politely, said, "My name is Clemens. We ought to have called on you before, and I beg your pardon for intruding now in this informal way. But your house is on fire." It was at the moment when life seemed at its best that shadows gathered. Jervis Langdon had never accepted his son-in-law's playful invitation to bring his bag and stay overnight, and now the time for it was past. In the spring his health gave way. Mrs. Clemens, who adored him, went to Elmira to be at his bedside. 3 months of lingering illness brought the end. His death was a great blow to Mrs. Clemens, and the strain of watching had been very hard. Her own health, never robust, became poor. A girlhood friend, who came to cheer her with a visit, was taken down with typhoid fever. Another long period of anxiety and nursing ended with the young woman's death in the Clemens home. To Mark Twain and his wife it seemed that their bright days were over. The arrival of little Langdon Clemens in November brought happiness, but his delicate hold on life was so uncertain that the burden of anxiety grew. Amid so many distractions Clemens found his work hard. His memoranda department in the Galaxy must be filled and be bright and readable. His work at the office could not be neglected. Then, too, he had made a contract with Bliss for another book, Roughing It, and he was trying to get started on that. He began to chafe under the relentless demands of the magazine and newspaper. Finally he could stand it no longer. He sold his interest in the Express at a loss, and gave up the memoranda. In the closing number, April 1871, he said, "For the last 8 months, with hardly an interval, I have had for my fellows and comrades, night and day, doctors and watchers of the sick. During these 8 months death has taken 2 members of my home circle, and malignantly threatened 2 others. All this I have experienced, yet all the time have been under contract to furnish humorous matter once a month for this magazine. To be a pirate on a low salary with no share of the profits in the business used to be my idea of an uncomfortable occupation, but I have other views now. To be a monthly humorist in a cheerless time is drearier." End of chapter 31. This is chapter 32 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain, by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 32, At Work on Roughing It. The Clemens family now went to Elmira, to Quarry Farm, a beautiful hilltop place overlooking the river and the town, the home of Mrs. Clemens's sister, Mrs. Theodore Crane. They did not expect to return to Buffalo, and the house there was offered for sale. For them the sunlight had gone out of it. Matters went better at Quarry Farm. The invalids gained strength. Work on the book progressed. The Clemenses that year fell in love with the place that was to mean so much to them in the many summers to come. Mark Twain was not altogether satisfied, however, with his writing. He was afraid it was not up to his literary standard. His spirits were at a low ebb when his old first editor, Joe Goodman, came East and stopped off at Elmira. Clemens hurried him out to the farm, and eagerly putting the chapters of Roughing It into his hands, asked him to read them. Goodman seated himself comfortably by a window, while the author went over to a table and pretended to write, but was really watching Goodman, who read page after page solemnly and with great deliberation. Presently Mark Twain could stand it no longer. He threw down his pen, exclaiming, "I knew it! I knew it! I've been writing nothing but rot. You have sat there all this time reading without a smile. But I am not wholly to blame. I have been trying to write a funny book with dead people and sickness everywhere. Oh, Joe, I wish I could die myself." "Mark," said Goodman, "I was reading critically, not for amusement, and so far as I have read and can judge, this is one of the best things you have ever written. I have found it perfectly absorbing. You are doing a great book." That was enough. Clemens knew that Goodman never spoke idly of such matters. The author of Roughing It was a changed man, full of enthusiasm, eager to go on. He offered to pay Goodman a salary to stay and furnish inspiration. Goodman declined the salary, but remained for several weeks, and during long walks which the two friends took over the hills, gave advice, recalled good material, and was a great help and comfort. In May, Clemens wrote to Bliss that he had 1,200 manuscript pages of the new book written, and was turning out from 30 to 65 per day. He was in high spirits. The family health had improved. Once more prospects were bright. He even allowed Redpath to persuade him to lecture again during the coming season. Selling his share of the Express at a loss had left Mark Twain considerably in debt, and lecture profits would furnish the quickest means of payment. When the summer ended, the Clemens family took up residence in Hartford, Connecticut, in the fine old Hooker house on Forest Street. Hartford held many attractions for Mark Twain. His publishers were located there. Also it was the home of a distinguished group of writers and of the Reverend Joe Twichell. Neither Clemens nor his wife had felt that they could return to Buffalo. The home there was sold, its contents packed and shipped. They did not see it again. His book finished, Mark Twain lectured pretty steadily that winter, often in the neighborhood of Boston, which was lecture headquarters. Mark Twain enjoyed Boston. In Redpath's office one could often meet and swap stories with Josh Billings, Henry W. Shaw, and Petroleum V. Nasby, David R. Locke. well-known humorists of that day, while in the strictly literary circle there were William Dean Howells, Thomas Bailey Aldrich, Bret Harte, who by this time had become famous and journeyed eastward, and others of their sort. They were all young and eager and merry then, and they gathered at luncheons in snug corners and talked gaily far into the dimness of winter afternoons. Harte had been immediately accorded a high place in the Boston group. Mark Twain, as a strictly literary man, was still regarded rather doubtfully by members of the older set, the Brahmins, as they were called, but the young men already hailed him joyfully, reveling in the fine, fearless humor of his writing, his wonderful talk, his boundless humanity. End of Chapter 32. This is Chapter 33 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 33, In England. Mark Twain closed his lecture season in February 1872, and during the same month his new book, Roughing It, came from the press. He disliked the lecture platform, and he felt that he could now abandon it. He had made up his loss in Buffalo and something besides. Furthermore, the advance sales on his book had been large. Roughing It, in fact, proved a very successful book. Like The Innocents Abroad, it was the first of its kind, fresh in its humor and description, true in its picture of the frontier life he had known. In 3 months 40,000 copies had been sold, and now, after more than 40 years, it is still a popular book. The life it describes is all gone, the scenes are changed. It is a record of a vanished time, a delightful history, as delightful today as ever. 1872 was an eventful year for Mark Twain. In March his second child, a little girl whom they named Susie, was born, and 3 months later the boy Langdon died. He had never been really strong, and a heavy cold and diphtheria brought the end. Clemens did little work that summer. He took his family to Saybrook, Connecticut, for the sea air, and near the end of August, when Mrs. Clemens had regained strength and courage, he sailed for England to gather material for a book on English life and customs. He felt very friendly toward the English, who had been highly appreciative of his writings, and he wished their better acquaintance. He gave out no word of the book idea, and it seems unlikely that anyone in England ever suspected it. He was there 3 months, and beyond some notebook memoranda made during the early weeks of his stay, he wrote not a line. He was too delighted with everything to write a book of his kind. In letters home he declared the country to be as beautiful as fairyland. By all classes attentions were showered upon him, honors such as he had never received even in America. W. D. Howells writes, Footnote 7, from Mark Twain by W. D. Howells, end of footnote 7. In England rank, fashion, and culture rejoiced in him. Lord Mayors, Lord Chief Justices, and magnates of many kinds were his hosts. He was desired in country houses, and his bold genius captivated the favor of periodicals that spurned the rest of our nation. He could not make a book, a humorous book, out of these people and their country. He was too fond of them. England fairly reveled in Mark Twain. At one of the great banquets a roll of the distinguished guests was called, and the names properly applauded. Mark Twain, busily engaged in low conversation with his neighbor, applauded without listening, vigorously or mildly, as the others led. Finally a name was followed by a great burst of long and vehement clapping. This must be some very great person indeed, and Mark Twain, not to be outdone in his approval, stoutly kept his hands going when all others had finished. "Whose name was that we were just applauding?" he asked of his neighbor. "Mark Twain's." But it was no matter. They took it all as one of his jokes. He was a wonder and a delight to them. Whatever he did or said was to them supremely amusing. When, on one occasion, a speaker humorously referred to his American habit of carrying a cotton umbrella, his reply that he did so "because it was the only kind of an umbrella that an Englishman wouldn't steal," was repeated all over England next day as one of the finest examples of wit since the days of Swift. He returned to America at the end of November, promising to come back and lecture to them the following year. End of chapter 33. This is chapter 34 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 34, A New Book and New English Triumphs. But if Mark Twain could find nothing to write of in England, he found no lack of material in America. That winter in Hartford, with Charles Dudley Warner, he wrote The Gilded Age. The Warners were neighbors, and the families visited back and forth. One night at dinner, when the two husbands were criticizing the novels their wives were reading, the wives suggested that their author husbands write a better one. The challenge was accepted. On the spur of the moment Warner and Clemens agreed that they would write a book together and began it immediately. Clemens had had an idea already in mind. It was to build a romance around that lovable dreamer, his mother's cousin, James Lambton, whom the reader will recall from an earlier chapter. Without delay he set to work, and soon completed the first 399 pages of the new story. Warner came over, and, after listening to its reading, went home and took up the story. In 2 months the novel was complete, Warner doing most of the romance, Mark Twain the character parts. Warner's portion was probably pure fiction, but Mark Twain's chapters were full of history. Judge Hawkins and wife were Mark Twain's father and mother, Washington Hawkins his brother Orion. Their doings with those of James Lambton as Colonel Sellers were of course elaborated, but the story of the Tennessee land, as told in that book, is very good history indeed. Laura Hawkins, however, was only real in the fact that she bore the name of Samuel Clemens' old playmate. The Gilded Age, published later in the year, was well received and sold largely. The character of Colonel Sellers at once took a place among the great fiction characters of the world, and is probably the best known of any American creation. His watchword, "There's millions in it," became a byword. The Clemenses decided to build in Hartford. They bought a plot of land on Farmington Avenue, in the literary neighborhood, and engaged an architect and builder. By spring the new house was well under way, and matters progressing so favorably, the owners decided to take a holiday while the work was going on. Clemens had been eager to show England to his wife, so, taking little Sissy, now a year old, they sailed in May to be gone half a year. They remained for a time in London, a period of honors and entertainment. If Mark Twain had been a lion on his first visit, he was hardly less than royalty now. His rooms at the Langham Hotel were like a court. The nation's most distinguished men, among them Robert Browning, Sir John Millais, Lord Houghton, and Sir Charles Dilke, came to pay their respects. Authors were calling constantly. Charles Reade and Wilkie Collins could not get enough of Mark Twain. Reade proposed to join with him in writing a novel, as Warner had done. Lewis Carroll did not call, being too timid, but they met the author of Alice in Wonderland one night at dinner. "The shyest, full-grown man, except Uncle Remus, I ever saw," Mark Twain once declared. Little Sissy and her father thrived on London life, but it wore on Mrs. Clemens. At the end of July they went quietly to Edinburgh, and settled at Veitch's Hotel on George Street. The strain of London life had been too much for Mrs. Clemens, and her health became poor. Unacquainted in Edinburgh, Clemens only remembered that Dr. John Brown, author of Rab and His Friends, lived there. Learning the address, he walked around to 23 Rutland Street and made himself known. Dr. Brown came forthwith, and Mrs. Clemens seemed better from the moment of his arrival. The acquaintance did not end there. For a month the author of Rab and the little Clemens family were together daily. Often they went with him to make his round of visits. He was always leaning out of the carriage to look at dogs. It was told of him that once, when he suddenly put his head from a carriage window, he dropped back with a disappointed look. "Who was it?" asked his companion. "Some one you know?" "No, a dog I don't know." Dr. John was beloved by everybody in Scotland, and his story of Rab had won him a world-wide following. Children adored him. Little Susie and he were playmates, and he named her Megalopis, a Greek term suggested by her great dark eyes. Mark Twain kept his promise to lecture to a London audience. On the 13th of October, in the Queen's Concert Rooms, Hanover Square, he gave Our Fellow Savages of the Sandwich Islands. The house was packed. Clemens was not introduced. He appeared on the platform in evening dress, assuming the character of a manager, announcing a disappointment. Mr. Clemens, he said, had been fully expected to be present. He paused, and loud murmurs arose from the audience. He lifted his hand, and the noise subsided. Then he added, "I am happy to say that Mark Twain is present, and will now give his lecture." The audience roared its approval. He continued his lectures at Hanover Square through the week, and at no time in his own country had he won such a complete triumph. He was the talk of the streets. The papers were full of him. The London Times declared his lectures had only whetted the public appetite for more. His manager, George Dolby, formerly manager for Charles Dickens, urged him to remain and continue the course through the winter. Clemens finally agreed that he would take his family back to America and come back himself within the month. This plan he carried out. Returning to London, he lectured steadily for 2 months in the big Hanover Square rooms, giving his "Roughing It" address, and it was only toward the end that his audience showed any sign of diminishing. There is probably no other such a lecture triumph on record. Mark Twain was at the pinnacle of his first glory. 36, in full health, prosperous, sought by the world's greatest, hailed in the highest places almost as a king. Tom Sawyer's dreams of greatness had been all too modest. In its most dazzling moments his imagination had never led him so far. End of chapter 34. This is chapter 35 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 35, Beginning Tom Sawyer. It was at the end of January, 1874, when Mark Twain returned to America. His reception abroad had increased his prestige at home. Howells and Aldrich came over from Boston to tell him what a great man he had become, to renew those Boston days of 3 years before, to talk and talk of all the things between the earth and sky. And Twitchell came in, of course, and Warner, and no one took account of time, or hurried, or worried about anything at all. "We had 2 such days as the aging sun no longer shines on in his round," wrote Howells long after. And he tells how he and Aldrich were so carried away with Clemens's success in subscription publication that on the way back to Boston they planned a book to sell in that way. It was to be called 12 Memorable Murders, and they had made 2 or 3 fortunes from it by the time they reached Boston. But the project ended there. "We never killed a single soul," Howells once confessed to the writer of this memoir. At Quarry Farm that summer Mark Twain began the writing of The Adventures of Tom Sawyer. He had been planning for some time to set down the story of those far-off days along the river-front at Hannibal, with John Briggs, Tom Blankenship, and the rest of that graceless band, and now in the cool luxury of a little study which Mrs. Crane had built for him on the hillside, he set himself to spin the fabric of his youth. The study was a delightful place to work. It was octagonal in shape, with windows on all sides, something like a pilot-house. From any direction the breeze could come, and there were fine views. To Twitchell he wrote, "It is a cozy nest, and just room in it for a sofa, table, and 3 or 4 chairs, and when the storm sweeps down the remote valley and the lightning flashes behind the hills beyond, and the rain beats on the roof over my head, imagine the luxury of it." He worked steadily there that summer. He would begin mornings, soon after breakfast, keep at it until nearly dinner-time, say until 5 or after, for it was not his habit to eat the midday meal. Other members of the family did not venture near the place. If he was wanted urgently, a horn was blown. His work finished, he would light a cigar, and stepping lightly down the stone flight that led to the house level, he would find where the family had assembled and read to them his day's work. Certainly those were golden days, and the tale of Tom and Huck and Joe Harper progressed. To Dr. John Brown in Scotland he wrote, "I have been writing 50 pages of manuscript a day, on an average, for some time now, and consequently have been so wrapped up in it and dead to everything else that I have fallen mighty short in letter-writing." But the inspiration of Tom and Huck gave out when the tale was half finished, or perhaps it gave way to a new interest. News came one day that a writer in San Francisco, without permission, had dramatized The Gilded Age, and that it was being played by John T. Raymond, an actor of much power. Mark Twain had himself planned to dramatize the character of Colonel Sellers, and had taken out dramatic copyright. He promptly stopped the California production, then wrote the dramatist a friendly letter, and presently bought the play of him and set in to rewrite it. It proved a great success. Raymond played it for several years. Colonel Sellers on the stage became fully as popular as in the book, and very profitable indeed. End of Chapter 35. This is Chapter 36 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 36. The New Home. The new home in Hartford was ready that autumn, the beautiful house finished or nearly finished, the handsome furnishings in place. It was a lovely spot. There were trees and grass, a green, shady slope that fell away to a quiet stream. The house itself, quite different from the most of the houses of that day, had many wings and balconies, and toward the back a great veranda that looked down the shaded slope. The kitchen was not at the back. As Mark Twain was unlike any other man that ever lived, so his house was not like any other houses. When asked why he built the kitchen toward the street, he said, "So the servants can see the circus go by without running into the front yard." But this was probably his afterthought. The kitchen wing extended toward Farmington Avenue, but it was a harmonious detail of the general plan. Many frequenters have tried to express the charm of Mark Twain's household. Few have succeeded, for it lay not in the house itself, nor in its furnishings, beautiful as these things were, but in the personality of its occupants, the daily round of their lives, the atmosphere which they unconsciously created. From its wide entrance hall and tiny jewel-like conservatory below to the billiard-room at the top of the house, it seemed perfectly appointed, serenely ordered, and full of welcome. The home of one of the most unusual and unaccountable personalities in the world was filled with gentleness and peace. It was Mrs. Clemens who was chiefly responsible. She was no longer the half-timid, inexperienced girl he had married. Association, study, and travel had brought her knowledge and confidence. When the great ones of the world came to visit America's most picturesque literary figure, she gave welcome to them, and filled her place at his side with such sweet grace that those who came to pay their dues to him often returned to pay still greater devotion to his companion. William Dean Howells, so often a visitor there, once said to the writer, "Words cannot express Mrs. Clemens, her fineness, her delicate, wonderful tact." And again, "She was not only a beautiful soul, but a woman of singular intellectual power." There were always visitors in the Clemens home. Above the mantel in the library was written, "The ornament of a house is the friends that frequent it," and the Clemens home never lacked of those ornaments, and they were of the world's best. No distinguished person came to America that did not pay a visit to Hartford and Mark Twain. Generally it was not merely a call, but a stay of days. The welcome was always genuine, the entertainment unstinted. George Warner, a close neighbor, once said, "The Clemens house was the only one I have ever known where there was never any preoccupation in the evenings, and where visitors were always welcome. Clemens was the best kind of a host. His evenings after dinner were an unending flow of stories." As for friends living near, they usually came and went at will, often without the ceremony of knocking or formal leave-taking. The two Warner families were among these, the home of Charles Dudley Warner being only a step away. Dr. and Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe were also close neighbors, while the Twitchell parsonage was not far. They were all like one great family, of which Mark Twain's home was the central gathering-place. End of chapter 36. This is Chapter 37 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine, Chapter 37, Old Times, Sketches, and Tom Sawyer. The Reverend Joseph H. Twitchell and Mark Twain used to take many long walks together, and once they decided to walk from Hartford to Boston, about 100 miles. They decided to allow 3 days for the trip, and really started one morning with some luncheon in a basket and a little bag of useful articles. It was a bright, brisk November day, and they succeeded in getting to Westford, a distance of 28 miles, that evening. But they were lame and footsore, and next morning, when they had limped 6 miles or so farther, Clemens telegraphed to Redpath, "We have made 35 miles in less than 5 days. This shows the thing can be done. Shall finish now by rail. Did you have any bets on us?" He also telegraphed Howells that they were about to arrive in Boston, and they did, in fact, reach the Howells home about 9 o'clock, and found excellent company, the Cambridge set, and a most welcome supper waiting. Clemens and Twitchell were ravenous. Clemens demanded food immediately. Howells writes, "I can see him now as he stood up in the midst of our friends, with his head thrown back, and in his hands a dish of those scalloped oysters without which no party in Cambridge was really a party, exulting in the tale of his adventure, which had abounded in the most original characters and amusing incidents at every mile of their progress." The pedestrians returned to Hartford a day or two later, by train. It was during another, though less extended, tour which Twitchell and Clemens made that fall, that the latter got his idea for a Mississippi book. Howells had been pleading for something for the January Atlantic, of which he was now chief editor, but thus far Mark Twain's inspiration had failed. He wrote at last, "My head won't go," but later, the same day, he sent another hasty line, "I take back the remark that I can't write for the January number, for Twitchell and I have had a long walk in the woods, and I got to telling him about old Mississippi days of steamboating glory and grandeur as I saw them, during 4 years, from the pilot-house. He said, 'What a virgin subject to hurl into a magazine!' I hadn't thought of that before. Would you like a series of papers to run through 3 months, or 6, or 9, or about 4 months, say?" Howells wrote at once, welcoming the idea. Clemens forthwith sent the first installment of that marvelous series of river chapters which rank today among the very best of his work. As pictures of the vanished Mississippi life they are so real, so convincing, so full of charm, that they can never grow old. As long as any one reads of the Mississippi, they will look up those chapters of Mark Twain's piloting days. When the first number appeared, John Hay wrote, "It is perfect, no more, no less. I don't see how you do it." The Old Times chapter ran through 7 numbers of the Atlantic, and show Mark Twain at his very best. They form now most of the early chapters of Life on the Mississippi. The remainder of that book was added about 7 years later. Those were busy literary days for Mark Twain. Writing the river chapters carried him back, and hardly had he finished them when he took up the neglected story of Tom and Huck, and finished that under full steam. He had first thought of publishing it in the Atlantic, but decided against this plan. He sent Howells the manuscript to read, and received the fullest praise. Howells wrote, "It is altogether the best boy story I ever read. It will be an immense success." Clemens, however, delayed publication. He had another volume in press, a collection of his sketches, among them the Jumping Frog and others of his California days. The Jumping Frog had been translated into French, and in this book Mark Twain published the French version and then a literal retranslation of his own, which is one of the most amusing features in the volume. As an example, the stranger's remark, "I don't see no p'ints about that frog that's any better than any other frog," in the literal retranslation becomes, "I no saw not that that frog had nothing of better than each frog," and Mark Twain parenthetically adds, "If that isn't grammar gone to seed, then I count myself no judge." Sketches new and old went very well, but the book had no such sale as The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which appeared a year later, December 1876. From the date of its issue it took its place as foremost of American stories of boy life, a place that to this day it shares only with Huck Finn. Mark Twain's own boy life in the little drowsy town of Hannibal, with John Briggs and Tom Blankenship, their adventures in and about the cave and river, made perfect material. The story is full of pure delight. The camp on the island is a picture of boy heaven. No boy that reads it but longs for the woods, and a campfire, and some bacon strips in the frying-pan. It is all so thrillingly told, and so vivid, we know certainly that it must all have happened. The Adventures of Tom Sawyer has taken a place side by side with Treasure Island. End of chapter 37. This is chapter 38 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 38. Home Pictures. Mark Twain was now regarded by many as the foremost American author. Certainly he was the most widely known. As a national feature he rivaled Niagara Falls. No civilized spot on earth that his name had not reached. Letters merely addressed Mark Twain found their way to him. Mark Twain, United States, was a common superscription. Mark Twain, the world, also reached him without delay, while Mark Twain somewhere and Mark Twain anywhere in due time came to Hartford. Mark Twain, God knows where, likewise arrived promptly, and in his reply he said he did. Then a letter addressed The Devil Knows Where also reached him, and he answered he did too. Surely these were the farthermost limits of fame. Countless anecdotes went the rounds of the press. Among them was one which happened to be true. Their near neighbor, Mrs. Harriet Beecher Stowe, was leaving for Florida one morning, and Clemens ran over early to say good-bye. On his return Mrs. Clemens looked at him severely. "Why, Youth," she said, "you haven't on any collar and tie." He said nothing, but went to his room, wrapped up those items in a neat package, which he sent over by a servant to Mrs. Stowe, with the line, "Herewith receive a call from the rest of me." Mrs. Stowe returned a witty note, in which she said he had discovered a new principle, that of making calls by installments, and asked whether in extreme cases a man might not send his clothes and be himself excused. Most of his work Mark Twain did at Quarry Farm. Each summer the family, there were two little girls now, Susie and Clara, went to that lovely place on the hilltop above Elmira, where there were plenty of green fields and cows and horses and apple-trees, a spot as wonderful to them as John Quarles's farm had been to their father so long ago. All the family loved Quarry Farm, and Mark Twain's work went more easily there. His winters were not suited to literary creation. There were too many social events, though once, it was the winter of '76, he wrote a play with Bret Harte, who came to Hartford and stayed at the Clemens home while the work was in progress. It was a Chinese play, Ah Sin, and the two had a hilarious time writing it, though the result did not prove much of a success with the public. Mark Twain often tried plays, one with Howells among others, but the Colonel Sellers play was his only success. Grand dinners, trips to Boston and New York, guests in his own home occupied much of Mark Twain's winter season. His leisure he gave to his children and to billiards. He had a passion for the game, and at any hour of the day or night was likely to be found in the room at the top of the house, knocking the balls about alone or with any visitor that he had enticed to that den. He mostly received his callers there and impressed them into the game. If they could play, well and good. If not, so much the better. He could beat them extravagantly, and he took huge delight in such contests. Every Friday evening a party of billiard lovers, Hartford men, gathered and played and told stories and smoked until the room was blue. Clemens never tired of the game. He could play all night. He would stay until the last man dropped from sheer weariness, and then go on knocking the balls about alone. But many evenings at home, early evenings, he gave to Susy and Clara. They had learned his gift as a romancer and demanded the most startling inventions. They would bring him a picture requiring him to fit a story to it without a moment's delay. Once he was suddenly ordered by Clara to make a story out of a plumber and a boggenstickler, which on the whole was easier than some of their requirements. Along the bookshelves were ornaments and pictures. A picture of a girl whom they called Emmeline was at one end, and at the other a cat. Every little while they compelled him to make a story beginning with the cat and ending with Emmeline. Always a new story, and never the other way about. The literary path from the cat to Emmeline was a perilous one, but in time he could have traveled it in his dreams. End of chapter 38. This is Chapter 39 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 39, Tramping Abroad. It was now going on 10 years since the publication of The Innocents Abroad, and there was a demand for another Mark Twain book of travel. Clemens considered the matter and decided that a walking tour in Europe might furnish the material he wanted. He spoke to his good friend, the Reverend Joe Twichell, and invited him to become his guest on such an excursion because, as he explained, he thought he could dig material enough out of Joe to make it a sound investment. As a matter of fact, he loved Twichell's companionship and was always inviting him to share his journeys to Boston, to Bermuda, to Washington, wherever interest or fancy led him. His plan now was to take the family to Germany in the spring, and let Twichell join them later for a summer tramp down through the Black Forest and Switzerland. Meantime, the Clemens household took up the study of German. The children had a German nurse, others a German teacher. The household atmosphere became Teutonic. Of course it all amused Mark Twain, as everything amused him, but he was a good student. In a brief time he had a fair knowledge of everyday German and a really surprising vocabulary. The little family sailed in April, 1878, and a few weeks later were settled in the Schloss Hotel on a hill above Heidelberg, overlooking the beautiful old castle, the ancient town, with the Neckar winding down the hazy valley, as fair a view as there is in all Germany. Clemens found a room for his work in a small house not far from the hotel. On the day of his arrival he had pointed out this house and said he had decided to work there, that his room would be the middle one on the third floor. Mrs. Clemens laughed and thought the occupants of the house might be surprised when he came over to take possession. They amused themselves by watching his people and trying to make out what they were like. One day he went over that way, and sure enough there was a sign, "Furnished Rooms," and the one he had pointed out from the hotel was vacant. It became his study forthwith. The travelers were delighted with their location. To Howells, Clemens wrote, Our bedroom has two great glass bird cages, enclosed balconies, one looking toward the Rhine Valley and sunset, the other looking up the Neckar cul-de-sac. And, naturally, we spent nearly all our time in these. We have tables and chairs in them. It must have been a noble genius who devised this hotel. Lord, how blessed is the repose, the tranquillity of this place! Only two sounds, the happy clamor of the birds in the groves and the muffled music of the Neckar tumbling over the opposing dikes. It is no hardship to lie awake while nights, for thin, subdued roar has exactly the sound of a steady rain beating upon a roof. It is so healing to the spirit, and it bears up the thread of one's imaginings as the accompaniment bears up a song. Twichell was summoned for August, and wrote back eagerly at the prospect. "Oh, my! Do you realize, Mark, what a symposium it is to be? I do. To begin with, I am thoroughly tired, and the rest will be worth everything. To walk with you and talk with you for weeks together, why, it's my dream of luxury." Meantime the struggle with the awful German language went on. Rosa, the maid, was required to speak to the children only in German, though little Clara at first would have none of it. Susy, 2 years older, tried, and really made progress, but one day she said pathetically, "Mamma, I wish Rosa was made in English." And presently she was writing to Aunt Sue, Mrs. Crane, at Quarry Farm, "I know a lot of German. Everybody says I know a lot. I give you $1,000,000 to see you, and you would give $200 to see the lovely woods we see." Twichell arrived August 1st. Clemens met him at Baden-Baden, and they immediately set forth on a tramp through the Black Forest, excursioning as they pleased and having a blissful time. They did not always walk. They were likely to take a carriage or a donkey-cart or even a train, when one conveniently happened along. They did not hurry, but idled and talked and gathered flowers, or gossiped with wayside natives, picturesque peasants in the Black Forest costume. In due time they crossed into Switzerland and prepared to conquer the Alps. The name Mark Twain had become about as well known in Europe as it was in America. His face, however, was less familiar. He was not often recognized in these wanderings, and his pen name was carefully concealed. It was a relief to him not to be an object of curiosity and lavish attention. Twichell's conscience now and then prompted him to reveal the truth. In one of his letters home he wrote how a young man at a hotel had especially delighted in Mark's table conversation, and how he, Twichell, had later taken the young man aside and divulged the speaker's identity. "I could not forbear telling him who Mark was, and the mingled surprise and pleasure his face exhibited made me glad I had done so." They did not climb many of the Alps on foot. They did scale the Rigi, after which Mark Twain was not in the best walking trim, though later they conquered Gemmi Pass, no small undertaking, that trail that winds up and up until the traveler has only the glaciers and white peaks and the little high-blooming flowers for company. All day long the friends would tramp and walk together, and when they did not walk they would hire a diligence or any vehicle that came handy, but whatever their means of travel, the joy of comradeship amid those superb surroundings was the same. In Twichell's letters home we get pleasant pictures of the Mark Twain of that day. "Mark today was immensely absorbed in flowers. He scrambled around and gathered a great variety, and manifested the intensest pleasure in them. Mark is splendid to walk with amid such grand scenery, for he talks so well about it, has such a power of strong, picturesque expression. I wish you might have heard him today. His vigorous speech nearly did justice to the things we saw." And in another place, "He can't bear to see the whip used, or to see a horse pull hard. Today, when the driver clucked up his horse and quickened his pace a little, Mark said, 'The fellow's got the notion that we were in a hurry.'" Another extract refers to an incident which Mark Twain also mentions in A Tramp Abroad, footnote number 8, chapter 33, end of footnote number 8. "Mark is a queer fellow. There is nothing so delights him as a swift, strong stream. You can hardly get him to leave one when once he is in the influence of its fascinations. To throw in stones and sticks seems to afford him rapture." Twichell goes on to tell how he threw some driftwood into a racing torrent, and how Mark went running downstream after it, waving and shouting in a sort of mad ecstasy. When a piece went over a fall and emerged to view in the foam below, he would jump up and down and yell. He acted just like a boy. Boy he was, then and always. Like Peter Pan, he never really grew up. That is, if growing up means to grow solemn and uninterested in play. Climbing the Gornergrat with Twichell, they sat down to rest, and a lamb from a nearby flock ventured toward them. Clemens held out his hand and called softly. The lamb ventured nearer, curious but timid. It was a scene for a painter, the great American humorist on one side of the game, and the silly little creature on the other, with the Matterhorn for a background. Mark was reminded that the time he was consuming was valuable, but to no purpose. The Gornergrat could wait. He held on with undiscouraged perseverance till he carried his point. The lamb finally put its nose in Mark's hand, and he was happy all the rest of the day. In A Tramp Abroad, Mark Twain burlesques most of the walking tour with Harris, Twichell, feeling, perhaps, that he must make humor at whatever cost. But today the other side of the picture seems more worth while. That it seemed so to him, also, even at the time, we may gather from a letter he sent after Twichell when it was all over and Twichell was on his way home. "Dear old Joe, it is actually all over. I was so low-spirited at the station yesterday, and this morning when I woke I couldn't seem to accept the dismal truth that you were really gone, and the pleasant tramping and talking at an end. Ah, my boy, it has been such a rich holiday for me, and I feel under such deep and honest obligations to you for coming. I am putting out of my mind all memory of the time when I misbehaved toward you and hurt you. I am resolved to consider it forgiven, and to store up and remember only the charming hours of the journey and the times when I was not unworthy to be with you and share a companionship which to me stands first after Livy's." Clemens had joined his family at Lausanne, and presently they journeyed down into Italy, returning later to Germany, to Munich, where they lived quietly with Fraulein Dahlweiner at No. 1A Karlstrasse, while he worked on his new book of travel. When spring came they went to Paris, and later to London, where the usual round of entertainment briefly claimed them. It was the 3rd of September, 1879, when they finally reached New York. The papers said that Mark Twain had changed in his year and a half of absence. He had somehow taken on a traveled look. One paper remarked that he looked older than when he went to Germany, and that his hair had turned quite gray. End of chapter 39. This is Chapter 40 of The Boy's Life of Mark Twain. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. The Boy's Life of Mark Twain by Albert Bigelow Paine. Chapter 40, The Prince and the Pauper. They went directly to Quarry Farm, where Clemens again took up work on his book, which he hoped to have ready for early publication. But his writing did not go as well as he had hoped, and it was long after they had returned to Hartford that the book was finally in the printer's hands. Meantime he had renewed work on a story begun 2 years before at Quarry Farm. Browsing among the books there one summer day, he happened to pick up The Prince and the Page by Charlotte M. Yonge. It was a story of a prince disguised as a blind beggar, and, as Mark Twain read, an idea came to him for an altogether different story or play of his own. He would have a prince and a pauper change places, and through a series of adventures learn each the trials and burdens of the other life. He presently gave up the play idea and began it as a story. His first intention had been to make the story quite modern, using the late King Edward VII., then Prince of Wales, as his prince, But it seemed to him that it would not do to lose a prince among the slums of modern London. He could not make it seem real. So he followed back through history until he came to the little son of Henry VIII, Edward Tudor, and decided that he would do. It was the kind of a story that Mark Twain loved to read and to write. By the end of that first summer he had finished a good portion of the exciting adventures of The Prince and the Pauper, and then, as was likely to happen, the inspiration waned and the manuscript was laid aside. But with the completion of A Tramp Abroad, a task which had grown wearisome, he turned to the luxury of romance with a glad heart. To Howells he wrote that he was taking so much pleasure in the writing that he wanted to make it last. "Did I ever tell you the plot of it? It begins at 9 a.m., January 27, 1547. My idea is to afford a realizing sense of the exceeding severity of the laws of that day by inflicting some of their penalties upon the king himself, and allowing him a chance to see the rest of them applied to others." Susie and Clara Clemens were old enough now to understand the story, and as he finished the chapters he read them aloud to his small home audience, a most valuable audience indeed, for he could judge from its eager interest or lack of attention just the measures of his success. These little creatures knew all about the writing of books. Susie's earliest recollection was Tom Sawyer read aloud from the manuscript. Also, they knew about plays. They could not remember a time when they did not take part in evening charades, a favorite amusement in the Clemens home. Mark Twain, who always loved his home and played with his children, invented the charades and their parts for them at first, but as they grew older they did not need much help. With the Twitchell and Warner children they organized a little company for their productions, and entertained the assembled households. They did not make any preparation for their parts. A word was selected and the syllables of it whispered to the little actors. Then they withdrew to the hall, where all sorts of costumes had been laid out for the evening, dressed their parts, and each group marched into the library, performed its syllable, and retired, leaving the audience of parents to guess the answer. Now and then, even at this early day, they gave little plays, and of course Mark Twain could not resist joining them. In time the plays took the place of the charades and became quite elaborate, with a stage and scenery, but we shall hear of this later on. The Prince and the Pauper came to an end in due season, in spite of the wish of both author and audience for it to go on forever. It was not published at once, for several reasons, the main one being that A Tramp Abroad had just been issued from the press, and a second book might interfere with its sale. As it was, The Tramp proved a successful book, never as successful as The Innocents, for neither its humor nor its description had quite the fresh quality of the earlier work. In the beginning, however, the sales were large, the advance orders amounting to 25,000 copies, and the return to the author $40,000 for the first year. End of chapter 40.